Hello and welcome to this special. We are joined by our special guest, Chris, and he is a strategic analyst and defense analyst. And what we are going to talk about today is something that is happening in India and something that is very important for not only in this part of the world, but especially in Western countries also. The kind of diplomatic row that has erupted in the recent days with Canadian President Justin Trudeau leveling allegations of Indian agencies' role in the killing of a person who has been Canadian citizen apparently, and who has been also a convict, a person who was most wanted in India, who was a terrorist, and he was involved in so many criminal activities in India. So that while the credential of that person is still very shady, the killing has clearly raised the diplomatic heat between the two sides very well. To talk more about how this whole episode is going to go, we are joined by Chris. So my first question will be, to begin with, why this issue has become so important that it has come to a level of diplomatic escalation where we are witnessing both sides expelling each other's diplomats and issuing travel advisory. What is so important? What is so bizarre that has happened in this episode, and why this is so important?
Well, thank you for having me. Well, I think we've got to look at the history of how Khalistan has injected itself into Indian and Canadian relations. I think if we go back in time to 1985, when there was the bombing of Air India 182, where over 300 lives were lost, the Canadian security agencies botched the investigation, and there had to be a fresh government investigation recently, in I think it was 2010 that they published the findings. And I think there's been a massive sort of propaganda effort in Canada, and we also know through the investigations of the National Investigative Agency in India that Khalistanis in Canada are using the country for propaganda. They're using it to finance, and they're also using it for terrorist actions. So I think for the Indian government in Canada to be at heads, it isn't surprising in my eyes. But I think what is surprising is for Justin Trudeau, without sort of facts, hard facts. He said that in his parliamentary speech to the Canadian Parliament, he basically said that there were credible allegations against the government of India. Now, credible allegations aren't credible facts. We know there's been, and we've got to admit, there's been suspicious amounts of Khalistanis in the diaspora. Leading figures have died over the last couple of years. So without hard evidence, it's a fact pattern. But a fact pattern doesn't mean it's evidence.
Chris, there is an issue, because what he has said in the Parliament of Canada, that must hold and that must have some standing, because it was made a statement like the world should know that there are facts, there are evidences which the Canadian government and the Prime Minister has. Apparently, there are reports also that he has been sharing those intelligence inputs with some of his peers and allies as well. So, if it is so, why there has been kind of delay in putting, or at least substantiating, something that is so bizarre in terms of allegation that he has put against India? So, why there is so wait? Why there is so delay? Kind of thing that the Canadian government is taking.
Yeah. Well, I think the important part is, I think the Canadian Royal Mounted Police, these are the guys who should be investigating a murder at the end of the day. We haven't had a statement from them yet on these allegations, and if they've actually got any evidence. But what we do know over the last couple of days, or at least what's been leaked to the press, is that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau he's briefed the G7 nations, he's briefed the G20, and that he's also raised this issue with his fellows in what they call the Five Eyes Alliance, which is effectively an English-speaking intelligence network that's between the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. So the thing that bothers me is that the Canadian opposition themselves have said, well, you need to provide facts if you're going to make such a grave allegation against the government of India, who is becoming strategically important for global security. And if you're going to make these allegations, you need to have proof. And I also think the reaction of the Australian Prime Minister, whose country is also a joint participant in the Five Eyes Alliance, he basically brushed the allegations off, which I think was quite telling. So I think either the Canadians are bluffing, which would be a hugely risky strategy, or they might have something, but they need to put it out there in the world for everybody to see and to be able to examine that evidence. And
of course,
at the moment, they haven't done any of that.
They might have ventured into a risky terrain, but isn't it a mere coincidence that the three countries which have come kind of openly stating about the issue that Canadian allegations have been against India, these are the three countries except New Zealand. All of them are the member of Five Eyes Intelligence. So does it look like there has been some, something going on among these countries for weeks now? Because while stating the allegation in Parliament, Justin Trudeau government said that for weeks they have been investigating, and they have those credible linkages and evidences regarding Indian agencies. So do you think there is something that has already been going on, some discussion or some monitoring, some sharing of information and intelligence input among the members of the issue?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't be surprised, because if we look at it from a sort of a Western viewpoint, we know that India has made the Khalistan issue in this what I would say this new generation of Khalistanis. India doesn't want it to return to the 1980s levels when violence was ripping the country apart. But what we've seen during the sort of the global war on terrorism, Khalistani activism was simmering away, building bigger. And now that I think that the focus is off sort of Islamist terrorism in the West, we are seeing that the propaganda campaigns are now starting to bear fruit. We've seen the attack on the Indian High Commission. So I think that the Western powers themselves know this is a concern for India, and I think they are trying to deal with it, and that's the positive thing. However, the Canadians are digging their heels in, and we all know in Canada there are ministers, senior ministers, and partners of Justin Trudeau who do have sympathies for Khalistani radicals. It's just a fact. So we do have to realize that sort of factor is playing out in all of this. So it's very difficult to see. And I think what we'll see in the future is the Canadians will be saying, oh, well, we reached out, the Americans are on board with this. The British are on board with this. Our partners are on board with this. But until they provide any facts and evidence, it's just conjecture, and very, very damaging, I think, for the sort of the global community going forward.
So, Chris, this is also interesting that of the other three members of the Five Eyes Intelligence Group, other three, US, UK, and Australia, they are also having the same issue of Khalistani group, the elements which are present in large numbers. We have had Indian missions being attacked. We have had Indian diplomats being threatened and intimidated. And these three nations have been in that zone where India has raised red flags in the past also regarding security concerns for its diplomat and the Indian community living there. So with the kind of support or tacit support that the Canadian government is now openly giving to this Khalistani group by trying to protect them in a way, you also mentioned that there are some ministers who have been sympathizers with this group. Do you think that the problem of Khalistan is going to get involved in? They are going to get new routes, new support system, new shelters, especially with the current Canadian government, which is going to be in power at least for 1.5 years from now?
Well, I think it's difficult to say, because I think when we look at this situation itself, it's so grave and so large, that I think the journalists who know nothing about Khalistan are looking at it as a new security and diplomatic issue. So I think we're going to have a new group of people examining exactly what Canada has been doing in relation to Khalistani extremists. I mean, because it's a pretty grave threat. India has basically been saying over the last sort of decade that Canada is harboring terrorist groups in Canada, and we would, and I think India has, and myself, we would like to see at least some kind of action or a receipt of that. And I think that's what is the worrying part is. And I think, and it's not just a Khalistani issue. We saw all through the sort of the global war on terrorism, and especially, and I know it's Commonwealth countries, we've seen where there are people who've done horrendous things, right? Getting sort of allowed shelter and harbor within Commonwealth countries, and then them basically saying, these guys, we can't imprison them, we can't go after them or jail them or extradite them because it's free expression. And I think that's a very dangerous sort of precedent descend. We spent sort of 20 years in the Canadians themselves tackling the sort of violence from the Taliban and other groups and Islamist groups, and then we're seeing a complete U-turn on the Khalistani issue. So I think it's a very dangerous precedent. But I think other nations, minus Canada, are taking India's sort of concern seriously.
While we can still talk about the future of Khalistan movement and whether the recent remarks by Justin Trudeau government would give them some sort of confidence and new, lease of life on Canadian soil, we can also have something going, not very good in terms of security alliance that US and EU and NATO were trying to create in Indo-Pacific. Canada, which has also released its Indo-Pacific strategy recently, had called India a very critical partner. Now, just a week ago, we saw India-Canada free trade agreement also being paused, and that was apparently because the Justin Trudeau government knew that it's going to get bad from here onwards, and there was no point having this, discussing all those financial architecture that the two countries were trying to build around. So, how the overall security aspect of Western alliance will be impacted with the latest, diplomatic gaffe that has happened between India and Canada, if you can say so, in this region.
Well, I think for me, it depends what kind of like international realist policy you subscribe to. I think in the Indo-Pacific, I don't think there'll be any changes whatsoever. I think even Canada will in its Ministry of Defense will partner with India and others to counter the Chinese threat. I think what we'll see is, though, on the sort of, if it is the domestic terrorism front, we will see that Canada has been shown to not be subscribing to international and global concerns of India and other nations. And I think that's the important part, because if a partnership is to really flourish, it's about looking at the concerns of those in the partnership and dealing with those security threats as your own. That's basically what a security partnership is. And I think countries, especially in the United States, are saying, listen, the Chinese pushing India in Ladakh, in Arunachal Pradesh, that is now our part of our security. So we saw from the Pentagon, we had condemnation of Chinese aggression, and we also saw the Department of Defense is setting up high altitude training in those areas with Indian forces. So I think as we're going forward, that's what partnership is all about. It's being able to take each other's concerns and help each other to address those concerns. That's the foundations of an alliance. And if Canada's the weak link here, it's going to end up with other countries thinking that Canada can't pull its weight or is reluctant to go or help us on certain issues. And I think that's dangerous for Canada, and it's dangerous for global security.
Do you think that played in minds of these leaders or these country members when there were apparently reluctance on coming out with a joint statement, at least from the G7 countries also, where Elena Jolie, the Canadian Foreign Minister, has said that she is going to raise the issue with G7 members. And apparently there was reluctance from the Five Eyes country also to come out with joint statement. They respectively have some official statement coming from White House or other Prime Ministerial office. I think so. You think the larger game in this region, the larger security game, is something that is taking importance on the minds of these leaders, and not Justin Trudeau is not paying enough attention to that?
Yeah, I think a lot of nations are taking sort of a hard-headed look, and the statements really are there's no real condemnation. They want a fair investigation. Obviously, they will support Canada up to a certain point, but there's never been any real evidence. And I think that's why when I made the example before, Prime Minister Albanese in Australia, basically a reporter asked him that very same question, and he was like, "Well, just cool it," and he was very relaxed about it. And I think until Canada present partners with hard evidence, and the evidence is out there, I don't know myself what evidence they've got, or if these credible allegations are true or whatever. So until these nations have been briefed properly, then I don't think we can really say how these governments are going to act. I certainly don't think the Canadians are going to come up with any kind of like Jamal Khashoggi kind of evidence or anything like that. But at the minute, it's a lot of smoke and mirrors, and everybody's sort of digging their sort of trenches at the minute. But until the Canadians provide the public and the world community with actual evidence, the allegations are just allegations, and I think a lot of nations will understand that, and I think they're willing to give India the benefit of the doubt at the minute.
So, like, at least now we can see at least two aspects of this overall, recent development that India and Canada bilateral ties have seen. First has been the domestic political compulsion, apparently, for the Justin Trudeau government, and the larger security architecture with which the Western allies would like to continue and sustain in this region of the world, in Asia and Indo-Pacific also. So, how do you see these two things panning out in the days to come? First, the India-Canada bilateral relationship in the context of Sikh extremism, which is kind of not being acted upon by the Canadian government, and the larger security alliance or the Western security presence that they want to create to contain the dominance of China in that region.
Well, to be honest, I don't think it will really matter. The Canadian allegations was against somebody who Indian authorities believed to be the head of a terrorist organization that was actively killing people in India. So I think a lot of nations will be actually quite sympathetic to India. So I don't think that there will be any real change, as I said, unless that we're presented in the public and the global community is presented with evidence from Canada, then anything could happen. But when we look at Saudi Arabia and the problem that they had, obviously we're not saying that India did have any involvement in the killing, but for Saudi Arabia, who did get caught with their fingers in the till and got caught red-handed, everybody's forgotten about it. It's the Saudis have made sort of their bilateral relations with other countries, and they've enhanced things, and everybody's just managed to work through it. But the difference between Jamal Khashoggi and Khalistani terrorists is these guys were terrorists. Why Canada wasn't investigating these guys and putting them on trial and doing other things?
Yeah, they had red corner notices and circulars by the Indian police forces, and still they were roaming around free. I think today there has been some statement by the Immigration Minister of Canada where they are confused when the actually citizenship was granted to Nirjar, whether it was in 2007 or 2015. But I mean, there is some discrepancies in the overall stature of him as a Canadian citizen as well.
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly right. I mean, but I think that the Canadians have pushed the debate now on whether his death or his murder was India's responsibility. But I think what it's done is shown that Canada has dragged its feet and has dismissed serious and grave allegations of being against Indian sovereignty, never mind Canadian sovereignty, that the Canadians haven't cared about guys who were attacking Indian sovereignty. And I think that's what the issue that I hope doesn't get missed in all this sort of international brouhaha.
In the days to come, I mean, this is one of the lowest point in India-Canada bilateral relationship, I believe, in the recent years, maybe since the bombing of Indian Airlines plane, the Kanishka. How long do you see this tension will continue to go on? I mean, for how long? Because there is a huge Indian diaspora who lives in Canada, and they have been living in their peace and harmony. And such conflicting relationship between the two nations would certainly impact their the way they live there and the way they are branded and labeled by the people or the larger population in Canada.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's not just sort of, it's not just isolated to Canadians and Indians in Canada. A lot of people are fearful of Khalistanis getting emboldened, and then we've seen harassment in the UK of British Sikhs who don't subscribe to the radicalism of Khalistanis, and we've seen it in Canada, we've seen it in other places. So I think you're right to point that out. But I think this issue with Canada will be brushed off unless the Canadians actually have any physical and compelling evidence.
Of course, I mean, we can, from here onwards, we can only wish that the situation will not be as bad as it looks right now because of the huge people-to-people connect that the two countries have developed in the last several decades. Thank you, Mr. Chris Blackburn, security expert and defense analyst, for talking to us on the issue that is very burning right now between India and Canada's bilateral relationship. We have seen several high-level exits happening in the diplomatic community from both the sides, and we hope that this remains at this level and it doesn't flare up further. Thank you for talking to us. Thank you for joining us.